Douglas found the battered alien girl cowering behind a dumpster, her skin blue with bruises. The human mercenary had trudged through the seedy spaceport slums for hours when he heard her whimper. His plasma pistol at the ready, he approached the trash-strewn dead end. The girl shrank back terrified as he holstered his gun and held out a ration bar. She wolfed it down, staring at him with wary orange eyes. Glancing around the neon-lit alleyways, Douglas scooped up the girl, who didn't resist. He carried her quickly back to his battered freighter. In the cramped medbay, he awkwardly tended to her wounds as tears streamed silently down her face. Unsure what to do, Douglas gruffly said she could stay until healed. He turned to go to the cockpit, but froze when her small hand caught his sleeve. The Bolian girl stared at him intently. In halting, accented standard, she whispered a single word, "Ymir." Douglas's weathered face, etched with scars from a hard life, softened slightly. He knew firsthand how cruel the galaxy could be, especially in the lawless fringes of Bolian space. Street kids like her were a dime a dozen, forgotten and discarded by society. But something in her eyes made him pause. A spark of defiance, a will to survive despite everything. It reminded him of himself at that age, scraping by on gutter trash before he escaped by joining a merc crew. Against his better judgment, Douglas decided to help her. It wouldn't be easy, and he was a wanted man with powerful enemies. Keeping the girl safe would paint a target on both their backs. But in that moment, he realized he couldn't just abandon her to the streets. Little did Douglas know, his split-second choice would change both their lives forever, setting them on a collision course with forces far greater than he ever imagined. For the battered young alien named Ymir was no ordinary girl, and the secrets locked in her past would alter the fate of the entire galaxy. In the medbay, Douglas carefully cleaned Ymir's wounds, applying antiseptic with a gentleness that surprised even himself. As he worked, the girl began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father, he was a high-ranking official on Bolia," she said, wincing as Douglas tended to a particularly nasty cut. "There was a coup, they killed him, and then they came for me." Douglas paused, meeting her haunted gaze. He had seen that look before in the eyes of refugees fleeing war-torn worlds. "I had nowhere to go," Ymir continued, her words coming faster now as if a dam had burst inside her. "I snuck onto a cargo ship, hid in the hold. I thought I was safe, but—" Her voice trailed off and she shuddered. Douglas noticed strange metal implants glinting on the back of her neck, their purpose unclear. He opened his mouth to ask about them, but suddenly an alarm blared through the ship. Douglas ran to the cockpit, his heart pounding. On the sensors, a massive Bolian warship loomed, its tractor beam locking onto his small freighter. He gripped the controls, trying desperately to break free, but it was no use. The beam was too strong. The freighter shuddered as the warship's airlock slammed into its hull. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors, Bolian soldiers armed to the teeth. They stormed into the medbay, ripping Ymir from the table. She screamed, fighting against their grip. Douglas drew his pistol and charged at them, shouting for them to let her go. But he was one man against a squad of elite troops. A rifle butt slammed into his temple, and everything went black. When Douglas came to, he was lying on a cold metal floor, his head throbbing. He sat up slowly, realizing he was in a holding cell, his weapons gone. Beyond the humming force field, Bolian soldiers marched past, their voices low and tense. "The package is secure," one of them said into a comm unit, preparing for transport to the facility. Douglas clenched his fists, his mind racing. He didn't know what the facility was, but he knew he couldn't let them take Ymir there. The hum of the ship changed pitch. They had docked somewhere. He had to act now, before they moved her. He rose to his feet, ignoring the pounding in his skull. He had no weapons, no plan. But he had to do something. For reasons he didn't fully understand, he knew he couldn't abandon this strange, frightened girl to whatever fate the Bolians had in store for her. The force field flickered and vanished as a guard entered the cell block. Douglas tensed, ready to make his move. It was a desperate gamble, but it was Ymir's only chance. He lunged forward, his hands outstretched, as the guard turned toward him with a shout of surprise. This was it. No turning back now. As the force field flickered off, Douglas surged forward, slamming into the unprepared guard. The two men crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, grappling for control of the guard's rifle. Douglas finally wrenched it free, bringing the butt of the weapon down hard on the Bolian's temple. The guard went limp. Heart pounding, Douglas stepped out into the corridor. The stolen rifle clutched tightly to his chest. Alarms began to wail, the harsh sound echoing off the metal walls. He had to find Ymir, fast. He moved quickly, checking each doorway, searching for any sign of the girl. Rounding a corner, he skidded to a halt, finding himself face to face with a squad of heavily armed Bolian soldiers. For a moment, no one moved, the tension thick in the air. "Drop your weapon," one of the soldiers barked, his rifle trained on Douglas's chest. "Drop it now!" Douglas hesitated, his finger tightening on the trigger. He was outnumbered and outgunned, with no cover in sight. Just as the standoff seemed about to explode into violence, a massive shockwave rocked the ship, sending everyone sprawling. Klaxons blared, warning of hull breaches and system failures. In the midst of the chaos, Douglas caught a glimpse of a gurney being wheeled rapidly down a side passage, a small, still form strapped to it. Ymir. Bolian scientists surrounded the gurney, their faces grim and urgent. Douglas surged to his feet, firing blindly at the soldiers as he sprinted after Ymir. Plasma bolts sizzled past him, scorching the bulkheads. He returned fire as he ran, not daring to slow down. Another explosion shook the ship, nearly knocking him off his feet. Smoke began to fill the corridors, acrid and thick. With a sinking feeling, Douglas realized the Bolian vessel was under heavy attack. By who? He had no idea. He put on a burst of speed, desperate to reach Ymir before her captors could spirit her away. Ahead, the scientists had paused before a massive blast door, frantically punching codes into a keypad. Douglas raised his rifle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Step away from her," he shouted, his voice raw. "Now!" The scientists froze, their hands slowly rising. Douglas advanced, his weapon unwavering. He was so close, Ymir just feet away. Suddenly the ship's intercom crackled to life, a cold, emotionless voice filling the air. "Attention, Bolian vessel. You have 5 minutes to surrender the specimen. Failure to comply will result in your complete destruction." Douglas felt a chill run down his spine. Specimen? Ymir? He stared down at the unconscious girl, a terrible realization dawning. He wasn't the only one hunting her, and whoever was out there was willing to annihilate an entire ship to get her. The ship bucked violently as another salvo slammed into its hull, nearly knocking Douglas off his feet. He had no choice. Lunging forward, he grabbed Ymir, slinging her limp form over his shoulder. Then he ran, weaving through the smoke and debris-filled corridors, frantically searching for an escape pod. Behind him, he could hear the Bolian soldiers in pursuit, their shouts and footsteps drawing closer. Plasma bolts whipped past, narrowly missing him. Ahead, through the haze, he spotted a row of escape pod hatches. With a final burst of speed, he reached them, slamming his fist down on the release button. The hatch hissed open, revealing the cramped interior of the pod. Douglas hurled himself inside, yanking Ymir in after him. He jabbed at the launch controls, his heart in his throat. The hatch sealed with a hiss, and a moment later, the pod blasted free of the ship, rocketing into the void. As the pod spun away, Douglas risked a glance back at the Bolian vessel. His eyes widened in shock. A sleek black ship, unlike anything he'd ever seen, was decloaking beside the Bolian cruiser. It was massive, dwarfing the other vessel, its hull seeming to absorb all light. A barrage of searing white energy lanced out from the black ship, slicing through the Bolian vessel like a knife through butter. Explosions blossomed along the cruiser's hull as it crumpled inward, like a soda can crushed by an invisible fist. In moments, it was gone, reduced to a spreading cloud of debris. Douglas slumped back in his seat, numb with shock and exhaustion. Beside him, Ymir stirred slightly, a faint moan escaping her lips. He looked down at her, this strange, helpless girl he had risked everything to save. Who was she? Why were so many different factions willing to kill for her? And now that he had her, where could they possibly go? As the pod drifted through the endless expanse of space, Douglas felt a heavy weight settle over him. He was alone, cut off from everything and everyone he knew, with a mysterious, wanted girl as his only companion. The universe suddenly seemed vast and cold and full of hidden dangers. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. One thing at a time. He had to find a safe harbor, somewhere to lay low and regroup. And then, somehow, he would get answers. He owed Ymir that much. He leaned over the pod's control panel, scanning the star maps, looking for any glimmer of hope. In the back of his mind, one thought repeated over and over, like a stuck vid loop. What the hell had he gotten himself into? In the cramped confines of the escape pod, Douglas and Ymir drifted through the void, the weight of their dwindling options pressing down on them. The life support systems blinked warnings in muted shades of red, the air recyclers struggling to keep the atmosphere breathable. Ymir huddled in the corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, eyes haunted and distant. Douglas checked their meager supplies for the dozenth time, lips pressed into a thin line. A few ration bars, a half-empty water bladder, a basic medkit. Not enough. Not nearly enough. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, his mind racing. They needed help, a place to regroup to plan their next move. But who could they trust? In a galaxy where even the shadows had eyes, allies were a rare commodity. Zax. The name flashed through his thoughts, a spark of hope in the darkness. An information broker, a dealer in secrets and whispers. They'd worked together once, years ago, on a job Douglas would rather forget. But Zax had connections, resources. If anyone could help them, it would be him. Ymir lifted her head as Douglas changed course, angling the pod toward a distant cluster of asteroids. He met her questioning gaze, his voice low and urgent. "We're going to see an old contact of mine. He might be able to help us." The pod shuddered as they entered the asteroid field, chunks of rock scraping against the hull. Douglas gritted his teeth, hands flying over the controls, weaving through the treacherous maze. Ymir gripped the edge of her seat, eyes wide, as a particularly large asteroid loomed ahead, filling the view screen. At the last moment, Douglas sent the pod into a dizzying spin, narrowly avoiding collision. They emerged from the field, battered but intact, a small, nondescript asteroid dead ahead. As they approached, a hidden hangar yawned open, swallowing the pod. They docked with a gentle thud, the hangar sealing shut behind them. Douglas helped Ymir to her feet, his hand resting lightly on his holstered pistol. The airlock cycled open, revealing a dimly lit corridor, shadows clinging to the walls. Douglas stepped out cautiously, Ymir close behind. The air was stale, tinged with the acrid scent of unfamiliar chemicals. A figure detached itself from the gloom, spindly limbs unfolding as it moved toward them, insectoid with compound eyes that glittered in the low light. Zax. "Douglas," Zax chittered, mandibles clicking. "It's been a long time." Douglas nodded, his posture wary. "I need your help, Zax. Information." Zax's head cocked to one side, gaze flicking to Ymir. "And what will you offer in return?" Douglas unslung a pack from his shoulder, opening it to reveal their meager supplies. Zax leaned forward, examining the contents, then straightened. "Very well, come." They followed Zax deeper into the base, past secluded rooms filled with humming equipment, the purpose of which Douglas could only guess. Finally, Zax led them into a small, dimly lit chamber, gesturing for them to sit. As Douglas explained their situation, Zax listened silently, compound eyes unreadable. When Douglas finished, Zax leaned back, steepling his spindly fingers. "The girl's implants," Zax said slowly, "are part of a secret Bolian project, an attempt to create telepathic super-soldiers." Douglas glanced at Ymir, saw the fear in her eyes. "Telepathic?" Zax nodded. "She is the only successful test subject, and now various factions within the Bolian military, as well as other interested parties, are hunting her. seeking to exploit her abilities. Douglas's hand clenched into a fist. What abilities? But before Zax could answer, the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on, bathing the room in an eerie red glow. In the distance, the sound of gunfire echoed. Zax rose to his feet, eyes wide. "We have to—" A burst of gunfire erupted in the corridor outside, followed by a scream. Douglas drew his pistol, pushing Ymir behind him. The door burst open, revealing a group of heavily armed insectoid assassins, their carapaces gleaming in the dim light. "Run!" Douglas shouted, firing at the assassins. Ymir obeyed, sprinting for the far door, Douglas close on her heels. They raced through the corridors, the sound of pursuit close behind. Gunfire chased them, bullets sparking off the walls. They burst into the hangar, running for the escape pod, but as they approached, they skidded to a halt, eyes wide. A dozen insectoid corpses littered the ground around the pod, ichor pooling beneath them. And there, scrawled across the pod's hull in luminous slime, a message: "Surrender the girl." Douglas stared at the words, a cold dread settling in his stomach. They were being hunted, cornered, and now even their only means of escape had been compromised. He turned to Ymir, saw the terror in her eyes. He had to protect her, had to keep her safe, but how? Where could they go now? And then it hit him. His brother, his estranged brother, a high-ranking officer in the Bolian military. If anyone would have answers, it would be him. But the thought filled Douglas with dread. He had sworn never to speak to his brother again, not after what happened between them. The very idea of facing him now, of asking for his help. The sound of footsteps echoing in the corridor behind them snapped Douglas back to the present. They were out of time, out of options. He looked at Ymir, jaw set with grim determination. "We have to go," he said quietly. "And there's only one place left to turn." He just hoped that when the time came his brother would be willing to listen. Douglas and Ymir crept through the shadowed corridors of the Bolian military base, the hum of machinery and distant footsteps echoing off the metal walls. Douglas's heart pounded in his ears as he navigated the labyrinthine layout, his old memories guiding them through forgotten maintenance shafts and seldom-used service tunnels. Ymir followed close behind, her breaths shallow and quick. At last they reached the door to Zane's quarters. Douglas hesitated, his hand hovering over the control panel. The last time he'd seen his brother, harsh words had been exchanged, old wounds reopened, but there was no turning back now. He punched in the code, and the door slid open with a hiss. Zayn spun around, his eyes widening as he saw Douglas and Ymir. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "I need answers," Douglas said, his voice low and urgent. "About the girl, about the project." Zayn's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're getting into. The Bolian military—" "I know enough," Douglas interrupted. "I know they're hunting her, that they'll stop at nothing to get her back." Zayn ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking older, wearier. "It's not that simple. The project, it's bigger than you can imagine. The potential—" "She's a child, Zayn," Douglas snapped, "not a weapon." "You think I don't know that?" Zayn's voice was heavy with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "But the higher-ups, they don't see it that way. They see a tool, an asset to be exploited." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Her abilities, Douglas, you have no idea. Telepathy, telekinesis, precognition. She's the first successful subject, the first of many." Douglas felt a chill run down his spine. "Many?" "There's a facility," Zayn said quietly. "Hidden, secret. That's where they're training the others, molding them into the perfect soldiers." Suddenly an alarm blared through the base, red lights flashing. Zayn's head snapped up, his face draining of color. "They know," he whispered. "They know I've told you." The door burst open, and soldiers poured into the room, weapons drawn. Douglas grabbed Ymir, pulling her behind him as he fired back, the room erupting into chaos. Beside him, Zayn fell, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. "Go," Zayn gasped, his voice wet with blood. "The facility. Coordinates." In my desk. Douglas hesitated, torn, but Zane shook his head. No time, he wheezed. Go stop them. With a final anguished look at his brother, Douglas grabbed Ymir and ran, leaving Zane behind as the soldiers closed in. Hours later, Douglas and Ymir stood before the secret facility, the coordinates from Zane's desk leading them to a remote, desolate moon. The base was eerily quiet, no signs of life or activity. They made their way inside, the silence pressing down on them like a physical weight. As they ventured deeper, a sense of wrongness grew, a feeling of something twisted and unnatural. And then they saw them, the soldiers, the products of the Bolians' experiments. But something had gone horribly wrong. The soldiers wandered the halls aimlessly, their eyes vacant, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. Some muttered to themselves, others lashed out at unseen enemies, and beneath it all, a sickening psychic pressure, a maelstrom of uncontrolled telepathic energy. They've lost control, Ymir whispered, her face pale. Their power, they've driven them mad. As if sensing their presence, the soldiers turned, their gazes focusing on Douglas and Ymir with sudden, terrifying intensity. They attacked, a wave of psychic energy slamming into Douglas, sending him flying. Ymir screamed, and the air around her shimmered, a pulse of telekinetic force erupting outwards. The soldiers stumbled, faltering, and Douglas surged to his feet, firing into their midst. The battle was fierce, desperate. The soldiers' powers matched against Ymir's raw, untrained abilities. One by one they fell, until only a single soldier remained, his eyes blazing with madness. He lashed out, a spear of pure psychic energy hurtling towards Douglas. But Ymir was there, throwing herself in front of it, her own power rising to meet it. The two forces collided, the air shimmering with heat and light. And then it was over. The soldier crumpled, lifeless, and Ymir swayed, blood trickling from her nose. Her eyes met Douglas's, a look of profound exhaustion and pain. "I can't," she whispered. "It's too much." She collapsed, her body going limp, and Douglas caught her, cradling her close. He felt for a pulse, his heart in his throat, but there was nothing. Only stillness and the weight of a life cut short. He carried her out of the facility, his steps heavy, his mind numb. The threat was ended, the project destroyed. But at what cost? Ymir was gone, and with her, a piece of Douglas himself. But even as grief threatened to overwhelm him, Douglas felt a flicker of determination, a spark of purpose. The Bolians would try again, he knew. They would find another Ymir, create more soldiers, and he would be there to stop them. For in the end, that was all he could do, fight and remember and carry the light of those lost in the face of an uncaring universe. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.